I'm talking to Luc Bas from the Climate Group. We've just seen some presentations that relate to the role of regions in terms of Copenhagen and climate change. How do you feel that regions in Europe can make a stand and make a lead for reducing emissions in the coming years?
Well, they already do so in many cases, and hopefully they will do even more. And I think one of the results of Copenhagen was that as the national governments, well, we could argue that, of course, the EU has its ambitious targets, and therefore the member states have. But still, even with those targets, it's the regions that will have to implement it, and the speed at which they do it will depend on their ambition as well. So what is important to mention is that, and there's a lot of debate between the local and the regional government role, which is really something different. So cities have their role and cities have their importance, and of course the metropoles like London and Paris are something very special at that as well. But the planning level and the legislation level and the regulation powers that many of those regions have are really vital to take the issue forward.
Now, I mean, you mentioned a very good point there. Clearly it's going to take at least another meeting, probably two, before the heads of government come to a real conclusion, a binding legal agreement on targets and funding and how the world can go forward. But in the meantime, 2020 is still approaching, things have to be done. And clearly the local regions are in a situation where they can influence, hospital policy, fire brigade policy, local transport, schools, and all sorts of buildings and all sorts of all sorts of energy use. How do you think that we in Europe and the climate change motion can communicate that their role is so important? How can we do that better?
Well, I think it's mainly of maybe I should start with an example of our database that we have. So we have collected profiles of regions from all over the world. So we do have an international angle to it, and we want to also exchange experiences from North American subnational governments, so to say, with the regions in Europe. But that database has a lot of proof of what the regions are doing, both on setting their own targets, making their own policy planning for it, and have their own regulation, and in many cases have their own legislation. So there is a lot of proof out there. It's just now a way of communicating it better, and that is where the Climate Group has been playing a role and will still play a role, and that's why we organize these meetings. We had a bigger meeting in Paris with a message to the European Commission, so that was a European focus. The Bonn meeting again will be to show, and it will be focused on specific technologies and what regional governments are doing in cooperation with business, because the Climate Group is at the same time a business group, so to say. So we have around 50 corporate members and currently around 20 government members. So especially also to see that collaboration, which can kick off much quicker than in many cases with the national governments. And companies have started to really understand that, and so we see a lot of questions and demand for information and for liaising with regional governments through us and in the international arena.
Now, we've just been hearing about funding, about amounts of money that are available for projects within the EU, and from EU, the money is from EU sources. These are going to be big and small projects. Now, how do you view the role coming up of cities and regions when it comes to instituting their own clean energy generation, their own, local sourced environmental projects? How do you view the forward motion?
Well, there is a forward motion is going on. First of all, again, we have to diverse the cities and the regions, because it's a different. Well, the problems are all the same in a sense, but how to solve them is different. The Covenant of Mayors is an incredibly good initiative, although it will need much more funding than is now on the table, and that is running. I've heard from the Committee of the Regions that they are thinking of getting something like a Covenant of the regional governments proper, so that could steer off something in Europe and really accelerate. But again, it's to look at those with the good examples and try to copy. You can't always copy it literally, but try to actually share those practices and see how the other regions can learn from that. And that's a vital thing. Another thing that today in the conference struck me again is how much of that money is not used on the regional policy front. It obviously has to do with the fact that most of that money is attributed to Eastern Europe, because it's about cohesion, and those regions have to catch up. So I think there's also a very important role for the regional governments in, let's say, the old member states to support their peers in Eastern Europe much more. Because Europe has to go as soon as possible at one pace and not in two, as we still see it now.
Sure. Okay. Now, there's one last element that I find very interesting about this. You've just mentioned businesses and the role of business. We've talked about local government and we've talked about national government. When it comes down to it, climate change is all about money, isn't it? We need money to make all these projects work. And clearly, private finance is going to be very important. These projects are going to cost in total trillions of dollars over the next 30 or 40 years. How do you view the role of large and small, for that matter, companies within Europe and the rest of the world in terms of financing, in terms of getting the funding there and making things really happen?
Obviously, there will always have to be public finance as a seed money or as an incentive. But it will triple, quadruple the outputs when companies start to invest and see the interest and the opportunities, because it's still too much presented as a burden issue rather than an opportunity issue. And many companies start to see it, start to really go from greenwashing to real green incentives and real green investments. So we see a shift there, and what we also see is that if a regional government, at least those that have the powers, may create a good environment for those companies to invest, then you see it happen faster. So yes, it's seed money, it's public finance in the end, but the large bit will have to come from governments, and they need, of course, security for their investment or stability, and that is still an issue. It's still an issue, especially with not having a global agreement. That said, there's a lot of proof that if Europe even becomes more ambitious, and which is needed, and Europe is a real target continent to say, we are used to have targets, and when a target is on the table, then we really start doing things, and we can see that with the targets that have been put forward in the past. And we see now that we have ambitious targets, the ambitious targets, the 2020 targets, and the whole debate is now, okay, how can we accelerate by putting even a more ambitious target? And that's the whole 30% debate which is going on now. And obviously there's a lot of study work being done on those that say like it's impossible because we'll lose our competition with Asia and with China, so just to name the one big threat they talk about. But it's really key that we do accelerate, that we have a tougher target, that we align the EU budget as a whole to that, and that we take the opportunity before the opportunity is actually lost, because that is what may happen if we do not accelerate even more in Europe to compete with China.
Sure. Leaving aside business competition elements for the moment, do you think a target of reducing emissions by 30% from 1990 levels within the EU is even possible? Imagining there's no business element to worry about, just cutting by that much, is that possible?
It is very much possible. I mean, there's a lot of study work that shows that it is possible. The one thing that we also know is that with the 20% that we have now, okay, it's possibly not the best argument to use, but we all know that recession had its role, and that we see now with the renewables targets, most of the 20% emission reduction will be achieved by the renewables target. But there is so much low-hanging fruit on the energy efficiency side, and so just by tapping into that much more, it should actually be not difficult to get to a 30%. But again, you need an instrument, and then you get into the debate on binding energy-saving targets, which is the only target in the energy and climate policy at the moment that is not binding.
Luc Bas, the Climate Group, thank you very much.